This is really the problem at the end of the day with our understanding of liberal free speech, that most discussions of free speech take place on an either or binary. So we think about freedom of speech either in terms of freedom or censorship. And as a result, because we think in those absolutes, because we think about freedom of speech too often in terms of abstract principles, it's very difficult to explain how freedom of speech might actually work in practice. So we struggle, and I think we're seeing this at the moment in the current political climate. We're struggling to talk about free speech or to make decisions about free speech, except in really, really extreme cases. So what I'm saying here, and this is touching on the Continuum readings, the readings from the academic journal Continuum that I've set for this week, that liberal free speech theory fails to consider properly how power operates in society and how this social power allows freedoms to be constantly defined and redefined. So we can think about freedom and censorship as abstract concepts, as extremes on a continuum, but real life operates in the space between those extremes. And that's what we as professional communicators, as members of a democracy, need to deal with. So how can we do that? So classic liberal definitions of freedom of speech are based on what the readings refer to as a logic of substitutability, which fails to consider context. So to explain that in a little more detail, liberal free speech theory argues, that because we allow people to access professionally produced consensual pornography on the basis of freedom of expression, we should also allow them to be able to access hate speech on the same grounds. Now, both of those forms of expression are problematic. But what I'm saying is that liberal theories of free speech privilege mainstream pornography on the basis of freedom of expression. We say people should be allowed to express their sexuality in any way they want as long as no one is being hurt. And as a result, we extend that to other forms of expression where the boundaries of harm are once again shown to be quite ambiguous. So liberal free speech argues that the same principles should apply in all contexts until it becomes dangerous to do so and the law is required to intervene. Now, that is a problem because we keep returning to this idea of when does harm occur? At what point does harm occur? So liberty in liberal free speech theory is seen to exist on kind of a continuous plane. There's no context, there's no messiness between those two extremes of expression and censorship. So while the liberal tradition of free speech works in theory, it fails us, and it fails us quite dramatically in practice. So liberal free speech theory fails to adequately consider ethical questions about moral rights and wrongs of expressing freedom. So what might be appropriate to say in one context is not appropriate in another. and ethics, morals need to be, or we can argue that ethics and morals need to play a much greater role in discussions of free speech, because that may lead us to rethinking what is acceptable to say in different contexts. Now, the readings from Continuum also point out that the liberal free speech argument is a circular one. It's a circular one. So liberal free speech argues, or the theory of liberal free speech argues, that we need to allow all opinions to exist because that's the only way we can establish the truth. Let's put this another way. We need to let all ideas exist in order to shut down the ones that don't contribute or benefit society. Now, while that idea is commendable, it's actually a way of limiting free expression. So liberal free speech theory is based on a circular argument. If we do not factor in questions of ethics, questions of morals, liberal free speech theory becomes a circular argument. We know that in practice, social forces, culture, the impact of institutions shape our understanding of freedom, and that makes freedom of expression context specific and historically influenced. Now, in order to think about free speech in a more fluid way, we need to explore the interaction of relevant laws and the prevailing ideologies and attitudes that relate at any given time to the topics that we're investigating. So that makes things messy. And once again, because liberal free speech, because liberalism privileges openness, the laws and the ideologies that we use to discuss contentious issues can be used by different groups to maintain division rather than consensus. So let me give you an example of this. We know that questions of identity, whether that's sexual identity, gender identity, racial identity, forms of identity, and how we treat people's diversity with respect is an important topic of conversation at the moment. No matter where we stand on that, we can agree that we're talking about questions of identity and questions of treating people's diversity with respect. Now, for some groups, those conversations are a sign of social progress. It's a good thing. It's a good thing that we talk about the place of transgender people in society. It's a good thing that we acknowledge people's rights for same-sex marriage. It's a good thing that we become more sensitive to people's religious backgrounds. However, for other people, for other groups, that increasing acknowledgement of diversity is a sign of their weakening power. So let's make this a little more practical. And you will see plenty of examples of this in the media. You will hear plenty of everyday conversations framed in these terms. So some white men will consider themselves to be under threat from radical feminists. So, they will complain that they can no longer, wolf whistle or catcall to women in the streets, that they don't know how to behave around women anymore. And I don't know how to be a man, and it's feminism's problem. So the interesting thing here is that according to that logic, men suddenly claim to have become a minority group. And because they can position themselves as a minority group, they can then claim that they need to assert their rights. They need to be able to express their identity. In other words, exactly the same argument that is made in favor of respecting people's diversity. So the difference is that in the case of, you know, men who feel under threat from feminism, they're making this argument in order to hold on to their established power. So that's the logic that lies behind arguments about political correctness gone mad. And that's being played out particularly strongly on US college and university campuses at the moment. That idea of identity politics and how someone's identity gives them the right or denies them the right to speak out on a particular issue is a contentious topic on American university campuses, and will increasingly become so on Australian university campuses. So that's one of the reasons why we're also exploring free speech in CCB 101, because it's real. It's something that you, not only as future professional communicators, but also as intelligent, thoughtful university students, need to think about and confront in many ways. As a result of all of this, liberal free speech theory finds itself in a contradictory position, because questions of equality become secondary to questions of freedom. Now, that's contradictory because freedom of speech in its classic form is about ensuring equality. So we're in a conundrum. We're in a conundrum here. And as a result, culture exists in a perpetual state of conflict. So a struggle for freedom, which works to maintain dominance over marginalized social groups, rather than looking for a common ground, looking for a way in which everyone can be treated equally. So how does this operate in practice? How do we see this being played out? For example, when Indigenous people call for Australia Day, for the date of Australia Day to be changed, we can see media reports that label them or label that call as divisive, uncivil, or dangerous, even to the point of calling it un-Australian, which is particularly ironic considering Indigenous people are the first Australians. So we can see those sorts of arguments being played out in the media. So in other words, the arguments in favor of diversity, in favor of freedom of expression, get turned back on the very people they're designed to protect. And we can also see that happening in law. So changes to the Racial Discrimination Act, which are designed to protect people from Indigenous backgrounds, from non-Anglo backgrounds, actually end up being weakened to allow those people to be spoken about in increasingly harmful ways. So that's the conundrum. That's the contradiction, and it is a dangerous contradiction. We're beginning to see, unfortunately, more and more how dangerous it is. And what we need to do, and your challenge, is how do we place questions of equality, ethics, and morals at the center of discussions of free speech. Now, that will involve a fundamental shift in our thinking about liberal forms of free speech. But I've made an argument here that our theory lets us down, or at least the readings this week have made an argument that our theoretical perspective on free speech lets us down. So if the theory doesn't work, let's update it. Let's change it so that it does work, to provide an equal society, a society based on equality, a society based on ethics, and a society based on morals that works for everyone.